In a small college town nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, life moved at a slower pace. The campus buzzed with energy, though, especially during the fall semester when students poured back in after summer break. Among them was a young woman who always seemed to stand out, not because she was loud or flashy, but because of her quiet confidence. She carried herself with purpose, as if she knew exactly what she believed in and wasn't afraid to let people know it. That's how most people saw her: calm, collected, and unshakable. This particular semester, she found herself sitting in a political science class taught by one of the most talked-about professors on campus. He was known for his sharp wit, fiery debates, and an unwavering belief in liberal ideals. His lectures were famous or infamous, depending on who you asked, for challenging students to think differently. Some loved him for pushing boundaries. Others dreaded walking into his classroom, fearing they'd be singled out for their opinions. But no matter where someone stood, everyone agreed. He didn't hold back. From the first day of class, it was clear that this professor had strong views about almost everything. He didn't just teach theories, he lived them. And while many students admired his passion, there were moments when his comments felt more like personal attacks than intellectual challenges. It wasn't uncommon for him to call out conservative-leaning students, poking fun at their beliefs or questioning their ability to adapt to new ideas. Most kept quiet during these moments, avoiding eye contact and hoping to blend into the background. But not her. From the start, she refused to shrink away. Whenever the professor made a sweeping statement about politics, economics, or society, she raised her hand without hesitation. Her voice was steady, her arguments well thought out. While some might have expected her to get defensive under pressure, she remained composed, even smiling faintly when the professor tried to provoke her. This intrigued him. Here was someone who wasn't intimidated by his reputation or his sharp tongue. Instead, she met him head-on, matching his intensity with logic and poise. As the weeks went by, their exchanges became a kind of routine. Every class session included at least one spirited debate, often sparked by something the professor said. Sometimes it was about government policies, other times about social issues. Whatever the topic, she was always ready with a counterpoint, calmly presenting her perspective while standing firm in her convictions. The rest of the class watched these interactions with a mix of fascination and unease. They admired her courage but couldn't help wondering how long she could keep it up before the professor pushed too far. One afternoon, the discussion turned particularly heated. The professor had been talking about the importance of flexibility in thinking, arguing that clinging rigidly to outdated ideas held individuals and societies back. As usual, she listened carefully, nodding along when she agreed but raising her hand when she didn't. When called upon, she offered a thoughtful rebuttal, explaining why she believed consistency in values mattered just as much as openness to change. The professor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know," he said after a pause, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "all this talk about principles and values sounds nice, but I wonder if it extends beyond your essays and speeches. Are you equally disciplined in every aspect of your life? Or is this just theoretical?" The room grew tense. Everyone could tell he wasn't done yet. Sure enough, he continued, "For instance, do you play piano? Because I imagine someone so committed to structure must excel at something as precise and orderly as classical music." The jab landed exactly as he intended. A few students chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Others glanced at her, waiting to see how she'd respond. For a brief moment, she looked surprised, caught off guard by the unexpected dig. But then, something shifted in her expression. Instead of retreating, she straightened her posture and met his gaze directly. "As a matter of fact," she replied evenly, "I do play piano. Would you like me to prove it?" The professor blinked, clearly not expecting her to accept the challenge. For a second he hesitated, perhaps realizing he'd stepped onto shaky ground. But then, with a smirk, he shrugged and said, "Be my guest. There's a recital hall open tonight. Let's see what you're made of." Murmurs rippled through the room as the class processed what had just happened. No one could believe she'd actually agreed to this. Later that evening, Word spread quickly across campus. Students whispered about the showdown between the outspoken professor and the quiet student who dared to stand her ground. By the time the recital hall doors opened, a modest crowd had gathered, curious to witness the outcome. Chairs filled up quickly, and soon the air buzzed with anticipation. People weren't sure what to expect. Was this going to be an awkward display of amateur talent or something else entirely? When she finally walked onto the stage, the room fell silent. She looked smaller under the bright lights, but her steps were steady as she approached the grand piano. Sitting down, she took a deep breath, her fingers hovering briefly above the keys before beginning to play. The first notes hung in the air, soft and delicate, drawing everyone in immediately. What followed was nothing short of mesmerizing. A performance that left the audience stunned and the professor rethinking everything he thought he knew about her. As the first notes of the piano echoed through the recital hall, a hush fell over the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats, some holding their breath, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. No one expected this, certainly not the professor, who stood near the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching intently. The young woman at the piano seemed completely absorbed, her hands moving gracefully across the keys as if they had a life of their own. There was something almost magical about the way she played, each note flowing seamlessly into the next. The piece she chose to start with was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a composition known for its emotional depth and delicate beauty. Her interpretation felt personal, as though she wasn't just playing the music but telling a story through it. The melody swelled and softened, filling the room with an intimacy that made everyone feel like they were part of something special. Even those who didn't know much about classical music could sense the emotion behind every keystroke. It was impossible not to be moved. When she reached the final chords of the Nocturne, there was a moment of silence before anyone dared to breathe again. Then, without missing a beat, she launched into Liszt's La Campanella. The contrast between the two pieces was striking. The soft, introspective tones of the Chopin gave way to the lively, intricate rhythms of the Liszt. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with precision and flair, tackling one challenging passage after another. The audience watched in awe as she navigated the technical demands of the piece with ease, her confidence growing with every measure. It wasn't just her skill that captivated them, it was her passion. You could see it in the way her body swayed, slightly with the music, how her expression shifted from focused determination to pure joy. She wasn't just performing, she was living the music, pouring her heart into every note. By the time she finished, the entire room erupted into applause. People clapped enthusiastically, some even rising to their feet in admiration. For a few moments, all eyes were on her, basking in the glow of what they had just witnessed. Standing near the back of the hall, the professor found himself frozen in place. He hadn't expected this, not even close. Sure, he'd thrown out the challenge as a joke, fully prepared to dismiss whatever came of it. But now, standing there listening to her play, he realized he'd underestimated her in every possible way. This wasn't just talent. It was artistry. It was discipline. It was proof that there was more to her than he, or anyone else, had given her credit for. As the applause died down, she rose from the bench and bowed slightly. Her cheeks flushed, but her smile genuine. The professor stepped forward then, still processing what he'd seen. Clearing his throat, he said, "That was incredible." His voice carried through the quiet room, surprising everyone, including himself. "I'll admit I didn't think you'd take me up on my challenge or that you'd deliver something like this." She looked at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Thank you," she replied simply, her tone polite but firm. "I hope this shows that being principled doesn't mean being inflexible. Sometimes it means knowing when to rise to a challenge and when to prove people wrong." Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. Students whispered among themselves, marveling at how effortlessly she had turned the tables on the professor. What started as a mocking remark had become a powerful statement about resilience, skill, and the importance of looking beyond surface-level assumptions. Even the professor couldn't deny the impact of the moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt humbled, and oddly inspired. Over the next few days, word spread quickly around campus. Everyone was talking about what had happened in the recital hall, the professor's sarcastic comment, her stunning performance, and the unexpected shift in their dynamic. Some students joked about it, teasing the professor good-naturedly whenever they saw him in the hallway. Others approached her directly, congratulating her and asking questions about her musical journey. Suddenly, she wasn't just the quiet conservative student anymore. She was someone whose courage and talent had earned widespread respect. For the professor, things were different too. He couldn't stop thinking about that night, the music, her composure, the way she handled both the challenge and his apology. Afterward, it made him reflect on his teaching style and the way he interacted with students. Had he been too quick to judge, too eager to push his own views onto others? These questions lingered in his mind, prompting him to reconsider how he approached debates in class. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in their political science lectures began to change subtly. While the professor still challenged students to think critically, his tone softened, especially when addressing her. Instead of targeting her beliefs with sharp remarks, he encouraged thoughtful discussion, acknowledging her contributions more openly. Other students noticed the shift and started participating more actively, emboldened by the example she had set. Slowly but surely, the classroom became less of a battleground and more of a space for genuine dialogue. Outside of class, the professor and the student occasionally found themselves discussing topics unrelated to politics. Music became a natural bridge between them, leading to conversations about composers, performances, and the role of art in shaping perspectives. They discovered shared interests they never would have imagined, proving that differences in ideology didn't have to be barriers to connection. Over time, their relationship evolved from adversarial to respectful, even collaborative. The ripple effects of that single evening extended far beyond the two of them. Across campus, students began approaching disagreements differently, seeking common ground rather than focusing solely on divides. Faculty members took note of the transformation, praising the incident as a reminder of the power of vulnerability and mutual respect. In a community often divided by strong opinions, it served as a lesson in finding unity, despite differences. In the end, the story wasn't just about a professor who underestimated a student or a student who proved him wrong. It was about growth, on both sides. For her, it was a chance to showcase her talents and stand up for herself in a way that commanded admiration. For him, it was an opportunity to learn, to step back from his biases, and to embrace the idea that people are rarely as one-dimensional as they seem. Together, they reminded everyone that real progress happens when we listen, engage, and allow ourselves to be surprised by the humanity in others. The buzz around campus didn't die down anytime soon. If anything, it grew louder as more people heard about what had happened in the recital hall. Students who hadn't been there that night were eager to hear first-hand accounts from those who had witnessed it. Some even joked that they wished they'd recorded the performance. It would have gone viral online for sure. Others speculated about how the professor must have felt, standing there watching someone he'd mocked turn the tables so effortlessly. The entire incident became a hot topic during lunch breaks, study sessions, and late-night hangouts. For her, she tried to stay grounded despite all the attention. While some might have relished being the center of campus gossip, she preferred to keep things low-key. She wasn't playing piano to impress anyone. She was simply doing something she loved. Still, it was hard not to notice how differently people treated her now. Classmates who used to nod politely but keep their distance started approaching her with questions, not just about music, but also about her views on various topics. It was as if her performance had given them permission to see her as a whole person rather than just a label. Even professors outside her political science class began acknowledging her in new ways. One day, after a particularly lively discussion in a philosophy seminar, another instructor pulled her aside and said, "You know, I heard about what happened in River's class. I think you handled it beautifully." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, but she appreciated the sentiment. It wasn't every day that someone went out of their way to acknowledge moments like these, especially when they involved standing up to authority figures. As for the professor, His reaction was more complicated. At first, he seemed almost embarrassed by the whole thing. When students teased him about underestimating her, he laughed it off with self-deprecating humor, saying things like, "Well, I guess I learned my lesson. Never challenge someone unless you're ready to be amazed." But beneath the jokes, there was a sense that he was genuinely processing what had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about how confidently she'd risen to his challenge, turning what could have been an awkward moment into something unforgettable. Over time, subtle changes began to show in his teaching style. Gone were the sharp jabs and sarcastic remarks aimed at students whose views differed from his own. Instead, he encouraged open dialogue, inviting everyone to share their perspectives. Without fear of ridicule, during one lecture he paused mid-sentence and said, "Let's remember that disagreement doesn't mean disrespect. We can learn from each other if we approach conversations with curiosity instead of judgment." The room fell silent for a moment, and then someone murmured, "That's deep," prompting quiet laughter. But the message stuck. Outside of class, the two of them found themselves crossing paths more often. Sometimes it was accidental, a chance encounter in the library, or near the coffee shop. But other times it felt deliberate, as though both were curious to explore this newfound connection. Their conversations usually started with small talk about upcoming assignments or interesting articles they'd read, but eventually, they drifted toward music. The professor admitted he didn't know much about classical compositions beyond the basics, which surprised her. "Really? I thought you'd be into jazz or blues given your personality," she teased one afternoon. He chuckled, shaking his head. "I wish. Honestly, I've always admired people who can play instruments. There's something about creating art that feels, well, essential, like breathing." She nodded thoughtfully, sensing the sincerity behind his words. They talked about composers, genres, and the role of music in shaping emotions. These discussions revealed a side of him she hadn't expected, someone who valued creativity and introspection as much as logic and debate. Word of their growing rapport spread quickly among students. Some found it amusing, joking that maybe she'd convert him to conservatism yet. Others saw it as proof that meaningful connections could form in unexpected places. Either way, it sparked conversations about the importance of finding common ground, even when ideologies clashed. A group of students once overheard them chatting animatedly about Beethoven's symphonies and later remarked, "Who knew Rivers had a soft spot for classical music?" As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of that single evening continued to shape the campus culture. Debates in classrooms became less heated and more collaborative. Professors encouraged students to listen actively and engage respectfully, while students made an effort to understand viewpoints different from their own. Even casual interactions in dorms and cafeterias reflected this shift. People weren't shying away from tough conversations anymore. They were embracing them, knowing that disagreement didn't have to end in division. One day, during a campus-wide panel discussion on free speech, the professor brought up the incident indirectly, sharing lessons he'd learned about assumptions and empathy. "We often judge others based on limited information," he said, addressing the audience. "But real growth happens when we let ourselves be surprised by the complexity of human beings. Talent, passion, resilience, these qualities transcend labels." Though he never mentioned her by name, everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. By the end of the semester, the story had become a kind of legend, a reminder that vulnerability and courage could bridge divides in ways no one anticipated. For her, it reinforced the belief that staying true to oneself was worth the risk even when faced with criticism. And for him, it served as a humbling yet inspiring lesson about the power of humility and openness. Together, they showed everyone that progress wasn't about winning arguments, it was about fostering understanding one conversation at a time. As the semester rolled on, the impact of that night in the recital hall continued to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The professor and the student weren't the only ones affected. The entire campus seemed to carry a new energy. Conversations that once felt tense or divisive now had an undertone of curiosity. Students who used to avoid discussing politics altogether were suddenly eager to share their thoughts, knowing they wouldn't be dismissed outright. It was as if everyone had been reminded of something important. Disagreement didn't have to mean disrespect. For her, life changed in small but significant ways. People approached her more often, not just to compliment her piano skills, but to ask about her opinions on everything from environmental policies to social justice issues. Some admitted they'd never understood conservative viewpoints before, but were willing to listen now. She welcomed these conversations, happy to explain her beliefs without feeling defensive. "It's not about convincing anyone," she told a classmate one afternoon. "It's about showing them there's room for different ideas, even if we don't always agree." Her confidence grew with each interaction, and so did her influence. A group of students started meeting informally to discuss current events, inspired by the way she handled debates in class. They called it the Open Forum, and though it began as a casual gathering, it quickly gained traction. Soon, other professors joined in, offering insights from their fields while encouraging respectful dialogue. Even those who initially doubted its success were impressed by how civil and productive the discussions became. Meanwhile, the professor found himself reflecting deeply on his own role in shaping classroom dynamics. He realized that while challenging students intellectually was important, he'd sometimes crossed a line into personal territory, mocking rather than motivating. That realization weighed heavily on him, especially after seeing how gracefully she'd responded to his sarcasm. She didn't lash out or shut down, he thought. She rose above it and taught me something in the process. Determined to make amends, he started incorporating lessons about empathy and critical thinking into his lectures. One day, he devoted an entire session to the concept of intellectual humility, the idea that being open to learning doesn't weaken your convictions, it strengthens them. "We're all works in progress," he said, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "And the best way to grow is by listening to perspectives that challenge us." The class erupted in applause, surprising even him. It wasn't often that students reacted so enthusiastically to abstract concepts. Outside of lectures, he made a conscious effort to connect with students individually. He attended campus events he'd normally skip, like art exhibits and poetry readings, curious to see what inspired others. At one such event, a photography showcase, he ran into her again. She was standing near a black and white photo of a stormy seascape, explaining to a friend why she loved it. "It reminds me of Chopin," she said with a smile. "All turbulence and beauty at the same time." He chuckled softly as he approached. "You really do see music everywhere, don't you?" he asked, startling her slightly. When she turned and saw him, her expression softened. "I guess I do," she replied. "But maybe that's because music helps me understand things better, including people." Their conversation flowed easily that evening, touching on everything from artistic inspiration to the challenges of staying true to oneself in a world full of noise. By the time they parted ways, both felt a renewed sense of mutual respect. For him, it was another reminder of how much he still had to learn, not just about teaching, but about connecting with others authentically. Back on campus, the ripple effects of their evolving relationship continued to spread. Other faculty members took note of the shift in tone during debates and began adopting similar approaches in their own classrooms. Instead of framing discussions as battles to be won, they encouraged collaboration and exploration. Professors, who had previously avoided controversial topics, now embraced them, confident that students could handle complexity with maturity. Even the administration noticed the change. During a faculty meeting, the dean praised the growing atmosphere of openness and inclusivity, citing specific examples of how students were engaging constructively with difficult subjects. "This is what education should be about," he said. "Not just imparting knowledge, but fostering understanding and courage." Students, too, felt empowered by the shift. Many reported feeling less afraid to speak up in class, knowing their voices would be heard without judgment. Others expressed gratitude for the opportunity to explore diverse perspectives without fear of ridicule. "It's like we're finally talking to each other instead of past each other," one senior remarked during a campus-wide forum. "And honestly, it feels amazing." By the end of the semester, the transformation was undeniable. What had started as a single moment of defiance in a recital hall had blossomed into something far greater. A culture of curiosity, respect, and resilience. The professor and the student may have sparked the change, but it was the collective effort of everyone involved that kept it alive. Looking back, neither of them could pinpoint exactly when things shifted. Maybe it was during their first heated debate in class, or perhaps it was the night she played piano, proving that talent and conviction could coexist beautifully. Whatever the catalyst, they knew one thing for sure. Growth happens when we let go of assumptions and embrace the humanity in each other. And sometimes all it takes is a little music, or a lot of heart, to remind us of that truth. The transformation on campus didn't happen overnight, but as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that something deeper was taking root. Conversations weren't just about who was right or wrong anymore. They were about understanding why people believed what they did. It was a subtle shift, but one that made all the difference. Students began to see debates not as competitions to win, but as opportunities to learn. And at the center of this change stood two individuals, the professor and the student whose unlikely connection had sparked it all. For her, the newfound openness created space to share more than just her musical talent. She started opening up about her journey, how growing up in a small town shaped her values, how she struggled with self-doubt when faced with criticism, and how playing piano had always been her way of finding balance. These stories resonated with others in ways she hadn't expected. One day after class, a freshman approached her hesitantly and said, "I never told anyone this before, but I play guitar too. I stopped because I thought no one would care. Hearing you talk about music makes me want to pick it up again." She smiled warmly, encouraging the young woman to keep going. "Music has a way of bringing people together," she said. "Even if you don't think it matters, trust me, it does." That moment stayed with her, reminding her that even small acts of vulnerability could inspire others to take risks of their own. The professor, meanwhile, found himself rethinking not only his teaching methods but also his role as an educator. He realized that while challenging students intellectually was important, creating a safe environment for them to express themselves mattered just as much. During one particularly memorable lecture, he paused mid-sentence and looked around the room. "Let's try something different today," he announced. "Instead of arguing over theories, let's focus on personal experiences. How have your backgrounds shaped your views? What stories do you bring to the table?" The response was overwhelming. Hands shot up across the room and students eagerly shared anecdotes about family traditions, cultural influences, and life-changing moments. Some spoke of overcoming adversity. Others talked about moments of privilege they'd taken for granted. The professor listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally nodding in agreement. By the end of the session, several students thanked him for giving them a platform to speak, not just as thinkers but as human beings. These changes weren't limited to the classroom. Across campus, clubs and organizations began adopting similar approaches. Debate teams shifted from aggressive point scoring to collaborative problem solving. Student government meetings focused less on partisan divides and more on practical solutions. Even casual conversations in dorm lounges and coffee shops reflected this new tone. People weren't afraid to disagree anymore, but they were also willing to listen. One evening, during a campus-wide event celebrating diversity, the professor introduced her to a colleague who taught literature. "You should meet Dr. Allen," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "She shares your passion for storytelling and might appreciate hearing about how music connects to narrative." The introduction led to a fascinating discussion about the parallels between composing a symphony and writing a novel. Both required structure, creativity, and emotional depth. As the three of them talked late into the night, it became evident that their shared love for art transcended academic disciplines and ideological differences. Word of these interactions spread quickly, inspiring others to seek out common ground in unexpected places. A group of engineering students collaborated with theater majors to design sets for an upcoming play. Athletes joined forces with environmental activists to organize cleanup drives around campus. These partnerships might have seemed unlikely at first, but they worked because everyone involved approached them with curiosity rather than skepticism. Even the local community noticed the shift. Residents who lived near the college remarked on how friendly and engaged the students seemed lately. At a town hall meeting, one elderly neighbor stood up and said, "Whatever you're doing at that school, keep it up. We need more young people like you, people who can disagree without being disagreeable." His words earned applause from both students and townsfolk alike. Amidst all this growth, there were still challenges. Not everyone embraced the new atmosphere immediately. Some professors resisted changing their rigid teaching styles, while a few students clung stubbornly to old grudges. But even these holdouts couldn't ignore the positive momentum sweeping through campus. Slowly but surely, they began to soften, drawn in by the energy of those around them. The turning point came during a special assembly held midway through the semester. The theme was Bridging Divides, and speakers included students, faculty, and community members. When it was her turn to take the stage, she chose to speak not about politics or ideology, but about the power of perseverance. "We live in a world that often tells us we have to choose sides," she said, her voice steady yet warm. "But what if we refuse to play that game? What if instead we chose to build bridges, through music, through conversation, through simple acts of kindness?" Her speech received a standing ovation, and later that evening the professor pulled her aside. "You know," he said with a grin, "you're going to make someone a great leader someday. Don't waste that gift." She laughed softly, brushing off the compliment, but deep down she felt a flicker of pride. For so long she'd doubted whether her quiet determination would ever be enough. Now, surrounded by people who believed in her, she finally understood that it was. As the semester drew to a close, the impact of everything that had transpired became undeniable. Final projects reflected collaboration across departments, friendships formed despite differing beliefs, and campus events celebrated unity and diversity. Even the annual holiday concert featured a surprise duet between her and another student, a naughty jazz saxophonist whose style couldn't have been more different from hers, yet somehow their performance blended seamlessly, earning cheers and applause from the packed auditorium. Looking back, neither she nor the professor could claim sole credit for the transformation. They were catalysts, yes, but the real work had been done by everyone who embraced the spirit of openness and empathy. Together they proved that labels like liberal or conservative didn't define them. What truly mattered was their willingness to see beyond those labels, to recognize the humanity in each other, and celebrate the beauty of shared experiences. And as the final notes of the holiday concert faded into silence, one thing was certain. The seeds of change planted that night in the recital hall had grown into something extraordinary, something lasting, something worth holding. As the semester wound down, the campus buzzed with a sense of accomplishment that went beyond grades or exams. It wasn't just about what students had learned in their textbooks, it was about how much they'd grown as individuals. The changes weren't flashy or dramatic. They were subtle, like ripples spreading across a pond after a single stone is dropped. And for many, those ripples started with her quiet defiance and his unexpected humility. For her, the end of the semester brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt proud of everything she'd achieved, not just academically, but personally. She'd stood up to someone who intimidated others without batting an eye, using her talent and composure to turn a moment of mockery into something meaningful. But on the other hand, she knew this chapter was coming to a close, and part of her wondered if the lessons they'd all learned would last once everyone went their separate ways. The professor seemed to share some of those concerns. As he graded final papers and prepared for winter break, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come since that tense first day of class. He remembered the sharp remarks, the sarcastic quips, the way he'd tried to provoke reactions from students simply because he could. Back then, he saw teaching as a battleground, a place where ideas clashed and only the strongest survived. Now, though, he understood that education was less about winning arguments and more about planting seeds. Seeds of curiosity, empathy, and understanding. One chilly December afternoon, as snow began dusting the ground outside, The two of them crossed paths near the library. She was bundled up in a thick scarf, carrying a stack of books under one arm, while he wore his usual tweed jacket, looking slightly frazzled from grading deadlines. They exchanged smiles, and after a brief pause, he said, "You know, I've been meaning to thank you properly." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "For what?" "For reminding me why I got into teaching in the first place," he replied earnestly. "I used to think my job was to challenge people, to push them until they cracked, but now I realize it's about helping them grow. You reminded me of that." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, but she didn't shy away. "Honestly, I think we both grew," she said softly. "I wouldn't have stepped up if you hadn't pushed me. Maybe not in the nicest way," she added with a teasing grin, "but still." He laughed, shaking his head. "Fair enough. Still, I owe you one. So, consider yourself officially invited to any future debates or piano duets you might want to join." They parted ways shortly after, but the conversation lingered in both their minds. For him, it reinforced the idea that every interaction carried potential for growth, if you were willing to listen. And for her, it solidified the belief that standing firm in your convictions didn't mean shutting others out. Sometimes it meant opening doors instead. Back in the dorm, students were busy packing up their rooms and saying goodbye to friends they wouldn't see again until spring. Conversations often turned nostalgic, with everyone reflecting on how much had changed over the past few months. One group of freshmen joked about how they'd walked onto campus expecting endless arguments and shouting matches, only to find themselves having some of the most thoughtful discussions of their lives. "I never thought I'd say this," one of them admitted during a late-night chat. "But I kind of miss arguing with people. Not the angry kind, though, the kind where you actually learn something." Another nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's weird. Like I still don't agree with half the stuff people say, but now I care more about why they believe it. Makes things less lonely, I guess." Even professors noticed the shift as they wrapped up their courses. During office hours, several reported hearing heartfelt thanks from students who appreciated being challenged, not attacked. "It's funny," one history professor remarked during a staff meeting. "This semester felt harder than usual, not because of the material, but because we were all trying so hard to connect. And honestly, it paid off." By the time finals week rolled around, the entire campus seemed to be operating on a different wavelength. Study groups weren't just about cramming information anymore. They were opportunities to share perspectives and laugh over shared struggles. Late-night coffee runs turned into impromptu philosophical debates. Even the library, usually a silent sanctuary, buzzed with quiet energy as students worked together rather than competing against each other en air. The last day of classes, the Student Center hosted a farewell event called Reflections. Students, faculty, and staff gathered to celebrate the end of the semester and to acknowledge the progress they'd made together. When it was her turn to speak, she took the stage holding nothing but a microphone. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. "This semester taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid," she began. "It's about doing what scares you anyway, even when people doubt you. Whether it's standing up for your beliefs, playing piano in front of strangers, or just having a tough conversation, every act of bravery matters. Because when we step outside our comfort zones, we give others permission to do the same." The room erupted into applause, and when she stepped down, the professor approached her with a warm smile. "Well said," he whispered before heading back to his seat. As the event drew to a close, attendees wrote notes on a large bulletin board titled, "What We're Taking Forward." Some wrote about friendships formed, others about lessons learned. But one note stood out among the rest. "We're more than our labels." That simple sentence captured everything they'd worked toward throughout the semester. It reminded them that no matter where life took them next, they carried the power to bridge divides and foster understanding. Labels like liberal, or conservative, and teacher or student didn't define them. What truly mattered was their willingness to see each other as human beings, flaws, strengths, and all. When the holiday break finally arrived, the campus fell quiet. Dorms emptied, classrooms locked up, and the snowy ground sparkled under pale winter sunlight. But even in the silence, the impact of what had happened remained. Somewhere, a freshman picked up her guitar again, inspired by a story she'd heard months ago. Elsewhere, a professor sat at his desk drafting plans for a new course that emphasized empathy alongside critical thinking. And somewhere else, a young woman sat at a piano, letting music carry her thoughts forward. Though the semester had ended, its legacy lived on, in the hearts of those who experienced it, and in the actions they'd take moving forward. Together, they proved that change doesn't require grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it starts with a single moment of courage, a shared melody, or a willingness to listen. And sometimes that's enough to transform an entire community. The holiday break brought a much-needed pause to the whirlwind of growth and change that had defined the semester. For many, it was a time to step back, reflect, and recharge. Students returned home to families who noticed subtle differences in them, how they spoke more thoughtfully about their college experiences or how they seemed eager to engage in conversations rather than shy away from them. Parents marveled at the maturity in their children's voices, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed. Back on campus after winter break, the air felt different. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of green, grass beneath. Spring was on its way, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose. Conversations picked up right where they'd left off before the holidays. But now there was an added layer of confidence, a collective understanding that disagreement didn't have to be divisive. Instead, it could be productive, even inspiring. For her, returning to school felt like coming home. Not just because she loved the campus, but because she'd found a place where she truly belonged. She wasn't just the quiet, conservative student anymore. She was someone people looked to for guidance, not necessarily because she always had the answers, but because she approached challenges with grace and determination. Her piano performances became regular features at campus events, drawing crowds who appreciated both her skill and the deeper messages behind her music. One evening, during a small gathering at the student center, she played a piece she'd composed, herself, a blend of classical structure and modern improvisation. Afterward, when asked what inspired it, she smiled and said, "It's about connection, about finding beauty in the spaces between us, even when we're different." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed her words, then erupted into applause. It wasn't just the music that moved them. It was the reminder that art could bridge gaps language sometimes couldn't. Meanwhile, the professor continued, refining his teaching methods, incorporating lessons he'd learned over the past months. He started each new semester with a simple question. What do you hope to learn this year? It wasn't just about academics. It was about personal growth. He encouraged students to write down their goals and revisit them throughout the term, using them as anchors during challenging times. This practice quickly caught on, spreading to other classes and departments. During one particularly memorable lecture, he introduced a concept he called the courage curve. Drawing a graph on the board, he explained, "Growth happens outside our comfort zones, but it's not easy. Every time we take a risk, whether it's speaking up in class, trying something new, or admitting we were wrong, we move along this curve. And while it might feel uncomfortable, it's also where real progress happens." His students nodded along, some scribbling notes furiously while others simply listened intently. When the lecture ended, several stayed behind to thank him, not just for the lesson, but for creating a space where taking risks felt safe. One young man hesitated near the door before finally approaching him. "I just wanted to say, your class changed my life," he admitted quietly. "I used to hate debates because I thought I wasn't smart enough to keep up. Now I actually look forward to them." Moments like these reminded the professor why he'd chosen this career path in the first place. Teaching wasn't just about imparting knowledge, it was about empowering others to discover their potential. And though he knew he still had plenty to learn himself, he took pride in knowing he was making a difference. As spring arrived in full bloom, the campus buzzed with activity. Clubs hosted workshops, sports teams competed fiercely yet respectfully, and collaborative projects flourished across disciplines. Even casual interactions carried a sense of optimism, as if everyone understood they were part of something bigger than themselves. Conversations once marked by tension now brimmed with curiosity and mutual respect. One sunny afternoon, the entire community gathered for an outdoor festival celebrating creativity and unity. Booths lined the quad, showcasing everything from poetry readings to robotics demonstrations. At one end, a group of students performed a dance routine set to original music composed by, you guessed it, the young woman whose piano skills had captivated so many. As the crowd cheered, she glanced toward the back of the audience and spotted the professor standing there, clapping along with everyone else. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod of gratitude. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the festival concluded with a bonfire. Students, faculty, and staff huddled around the flames, sharing stories and laughter under a canopy of stars. Someone handed her a guitar, jokingly urging her to play something. She laughed but obliged, strumming a few chords before passing it along to another student who joined in. Soon voices rose together in song, blending harmoniously despite varying levels of talent. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and camaraderie, it was clear that the changes sparked by a single night in the recital hall had taken root deeply. People weren't just coexisting. They were thriving together, embracing differences rather than fearing them. They'd proven that courage, empathy, and vulnerability weren't weaknesses. They were strengths that could transform communities. As Isio, the fire crackled softly in the background. She leaned back against the cool grass, gazing up at the sky. Beside her, the professor sat quietly, lost in thought. Neither needed to say anything. They both understood the significance of what had been achieved. Labels no longer mattered here. What remained was a shared commitment to growth, connection, and the belief that humanity was richer when celebrated in all its complexity. And so, as the semester drew to a close and another chapter began, the Yao campus stood as proof that change was possible, not through grand gestures but through countless small acts of bravery and kindness. Together, they had shown that bridging divides wasn't just a lofty ideal. It was something anyone could do. One conversation, one note, one moment at a time.